The ancient Egyptians harbored a deep-rooted sense of cultural superiority. They viewed themselves as a distinct and exceptional civilization, believing that their land was uniquely favored and shielded by natural barriers such as deserts and seas, which separated them from less fortunate neighbors. However, this image they projected was far from accurate. Located at the intersection of Africa, Asia, and the Mediterranean, Egypt was, in reality, a crossroads of people and cultures. From the earliest times, the fertile lands along the Nile and in the delta attracted migrants from surrounding arid and inhospitable regions to the west, east, and south. Each new wave of settlers brought with them skills, technologies, and traditions that would help reshape and revitalize Egyptian society. Occasionally, however, these newcomers arrived with motives beyond peaceful integration. Some carried aspirations of conquest along with their cultural contributions. While invasions were infrequent, Egypt was not invulnerable. When governed by a strong and centralized authority, such threats were often thwarted. But during times of political instability, particularly in the vulnerable northeast, the country became exposed to foreign ambitions. The decline of the Middle Kingdom's strength toward the end of one of its most prosperous periods opened the door to external threats. Egypt's determined focus on internal control and the defense of its frontiers had led its rulers to implement substantial measures to protect the northeastern delta. Unlike the fortified region of Semna in Nubia, where complete closure was achievable, Egypt's northeastern terrain made a total seal impossible. Nevertheless, a formidable defensive barrier known as the Walls of the Ruler, first established by Amenemhat I and reinforced by his heirs, was erected to discourage enemy advances. These fortifications were accompanied by regular patrols intended to observe, intercept, and regulate border crossings. At the center of these defenses stood Jaru, modern-day Tel el-Hebwa, a critical military stronghold that rivaled any fortress found in southern territories. Even with this fortified border, migration from the Near East continued. In fact, rather than being curtailed, the movement of people into the delta increased over time. Some of these newcomers were likely prisoners taken during Egyptian military campaigns. Others arrived legally, recruited by the state to contribute to mining expeditions in the Sinai, participate in large-scale building projects in the Fayum, or serve as scouts, trackers, and guards along Egypt's desert frontiers. By the close of this era, foreigners had become a noticeable presence in the population. Immigrants from the Near East not only integrated but also began to climb the social ladder, with some even attaining administrative roles. In the northeastern delta, where many had first settled, small clusters of foreign workers grew into sizable communities. These areas became magnets for further immigration, as people fleeing worsening conditions in their homelands sought refuge and opportunity among their already established kin in Egypt. One particular location became the focal point of this ongoing wave of newcomers. The town of Haweret, located on the eastern bank of the Pelusiac branch of the Nile, was originally founded as a modest border outpost by the Heracleopolitan dynasty. It was later re-established by Amenemhat I as part of his efforts to fortify Egypt's frontier. However, during the weakened reigns of his successors, Amenemhat IV and Sobenfuru, the border monitoring system appears to have faltered, allowing a continuous flow of migrants to enter the country. After settling in Haweret, these immigrants built homes in their own architectural style and preserved their cultural practices. But they were far from unfamiliar with Egyptian life. In fact, many were already well versed in Egyptian customs before arriving, indicating likely origins in places such as the Lebanese port of Kebni, which had long-standing political and cultural ties to Egypt. Some may have come from as far as Cyprus. Among them were Bedouin tribes from southern Palestine, drawn into the migration surge flooding into the Nile Delta. This convergence of different peoples, languages, and customs quickly transformed Haweret into a uniquely diverse town, unlike any other in the region. Given that individuals of Asiatic descent had already held important positions elsewhere in Egypt, it's not surprising that the chances for social advancement in Haweret were even greater. One notable official expressed his status in traditional Egyptian style by commissioning a large stone statue for his tomb chapel. However, he also made a point to highlight his foreign heritage. His portrait featured a large, red, mushroom-shaped hairstyle characteristic of immigrants from Kebni, and his skin was painted yellow, in line with the Egyptian artistic convention for portraying Asiatics. The curved throw stick he held served both as a symbol of his rank and a cultural marker, as it was also the hieroglyph for Asiatic. This individual clearly took pride in his heritage and displayed it openly in the face of Egyptian attitudes toward foreigners. Within just a generation, the Asiatic community in Hutweret had become secure in its distinct cultural identity, wealthy from Mediterranean trade, and increasingly assertive in local politics. A grand residence was constructed to serve as the governor's official quarters. It was, in essence, a palace with royal ambitions. Around it, senior officials were buried in elaborately decorated tombs, each one following Asiatic funerary traditions, such as the symbolic burial of 2 donkeys at the tomb's entrance. One such tomb belonged to a man who identified himself as the overseer of retinue, a title typically reserved for Egyptian officials managing relations with the region of Syria-Palestine. Another belonged to a chief steward and treasurer. Although these titles suggest the central administration still had a presence, it remains uncertain whether the leadership in Hutweret still regarded the king in Ijtai as their true authority. At the very least, the royal court appeared to be preoccupied with more pressing concerns elsewhere. After 200 years of rule by a single dynasty, the government found itself unprepared for the succession crisis that followed Seqenenra's short reign. It seemed as though the ruling elite had forgotten how their ancestors had dealt with the end of a royal line. What followed was a rapid and chaotic rotation of kings, echoing the disorder that marked the close of the Old Kingdom. Rulers came and went with startling speed, some occupying the throne for only a few months as one contender after another laid claim to the crown. Over the span of about 150 years, Egypt saw roughly 50 different rulers in stark contrast to the mere 8 kings of the preceding 2 centuries. It appears that Egypt's most influential families, unable to agree on a single heir, adopted a system of rotating succession. Since senior members of each competing family likely held the most prestige, Egypt effectively became a nation ruled by the elderly, with aged kings ascending one after the other, each attempting to leave a legacy. Despite this distortion of traditional kingship, the central government continued to function with surprising efficiency. The real work of governance fell to high officials like viziers and treasurers, while kings, once central to all state affairs, became more ceremonial. Government records of the time still paid formal respect to royal authority, even though it was the officials who now decided who would become king, not the other way around. However, the broader population could not ignore the cracks forming in the monarchy. Common citizens stopped referring to the king or royal palace on their funerary monuments, likely realizing that invoking such unstable figures held little sway over their chances in the afterlife. Many kings didn't rule long enough to even secure their own burial arrangements. Pyramid construction came to a near halt, with several monarchs resorting to being buried in simple shaft tombs located within older pyramid complexes built by 12th dynasty rulers. Expeditions to the mineral-rich Sinai Peninsula ceased entirely. The once glorious image of royal power faded, replaced by a monarchy struggling to project any sense of authority or permanence. The rise of Seqenenra III around 1680 BC highlighted just how much had changed in barely 50 years. Unlike many of his predecessors, Seqenenra made no attempt to conceal his humble origins. In fact, he celebrated them. Through inscriptions, he proudly acknowledged his common-born parents and openly recognized his non-royal family members, signaling a broader breakdown in the concept of divine kingship. His background in the military, including time served in the royal bodyguard, gave him insight into the inner workings of the court, which he used to his advantage. As king, he expanded the government by appointing more officials and revived construction efforts in an attempt to bring back some semblance of order. Still, these efforts were temporary fixes. The core of royal authority continued to weaken. Even the occasional resurgence of activity could not hide the fact that the monarchy's power was fading fast. The crisis was especially severe in Egypt's distant territories, particularly at the forts of occupied Wawat. A weakened administration no longer had the capacity to maintain the rotating military garrisons that had once protected these outposts during the height of the 12th dynasty. One after another, the Egyptian government surrendered these Nubian strongholds, having lost the ability to enforce its authority beyond the traditional boundaries of the two lands. The last to be relinquished were the forts in the Semna Gorge, where the 13th dynasty made a final, half-hearted attempt to uphold the frontier established by Senusret III. Eventually, even Semna itself was handed over to the local population as the last government representatives withdrew for good. With no more hope of regular supplies or support from the capital, some of the fortress communities began to consider an unthinkable option. Despite its past as Egypt's enemy, the Kingdom of Kush offered something the Egyptian state no longer could: gold, and the ability to pay those willing to serve. A similar collapse unfolded in the northeastern delta. Patrols ceased, garrisons were called back, and Egypt's most exposed frontier was effectively abandoned. It wasn't long before a new figure stepped into the vacuum. A man named Nehesi assumed control of the forts and quickly proclaimed himself king of an independent delta realm, establishing his capital at Hutweret and directly challenging the legitimacy of the central government at Ijtai. Once in power, Nehesi followed the traditional patterns of Egyptian kingship. He preserved the existing administrative structure and aligned himself with his local patron god, Seth, the deity of Hutweret. A temple built in his honor at this time may have served to demonstrate his religious devotion. With oak trees lining its courtyard and its walls painted a striking blue, the Asiatic temple was among the largest of its kind in the Near East and symbolized the wealth and self-assurance of Nehesi's short-lived kingdom. However, despite its promising start, Nehesi's rule faced internal strife. Acts of deliberate destruction, such as the defacement of earlier burial statues, point to social unrest. The town also took on a militarized character, with soldiers interred alongside their weapons and the streets resonating with the clamor of metalworkers forging arms. In earlier periods, a rebellious province would have been swiftly and brutally brought back under control. But the government at Ijtai was in no condition to reclaim Hutweret through military force. Nehesi's secession was a devastating blow to the 13th dynasty. It severed what little remained of Egypt's ties to the Near East and deprived the state of crucial trade revenue. The dynasty stumbled on, maintaining only the outward symbols of authority, but it was clear its power was hollow. It wasn't long before both the central government and the breakaway Delta Kingdom met their downfall, overwhelmed by a combination of natural calamities and human conflict. At Hutweret, famine and disease struck hard. Entire families were buried hastily, without the usual ceremonial care. The final years of the 13th dynasty in the south also saw an unusually rapid succession of rulers, suggesting that the plague had reached them too. As sickness swept across Lower Egypt, the region became vulnerable to foreign invasion. From beyond the eastern border, a formidable army armed with advanced weaponry invaded the weakened land. They quickly seized Hutweret and continued southward, eventually capturing the historic capital of Memphis. Thus began the rise of the Hyksos. The Hyksos represented an unprecedented episode in ancient Egyptian history. For over 100 years, a Semitic-speaking elite from the coastal region of Lebanon held dominion over northern Egypt, and were acknowledged as rulers throughout much of the country. They reshaped their capital at Hutweret into a city deeply rooted in Asiatic culture, worshipped the foreign deity Baal, and observed burial practices unfamiliar to Egyptian tradition. Even their names marked them as outsiders. To future generations, their ascendancy symbolized the unraveling of the established order. Yet during their rule, the northeastern delta flourished. Economic activity surged thanks to thriving trade with the eastern Mediterranean and beyond. Hutweret swelled to 2 or 3 times its previous size and emerged as the command center of a small empire that stretched into southern Palestine and along the Lebanese coastline. The fall of Memphis to the Hyksos was a devastating blow to the 13th dynasty, both symbolically and strategically. Memphis stood as a powerful emblem of national unity, positioned at the vital crossroads between the Nile Valley and the Delta. Losing it forced the royal court to abandon Ijtai and retreat hurriedly to the south. So sudden was their flight that they left behind valuable temple and state archives, meaning future dynasties had to reconstruct religious texts from scratch, cut off from the accumulated wisdom of past generations. The displaced court re-established a makeshift government in Thebes, the traditional bastion of Egyptian autonomy. However, their authority had diminished drastically, now confined to the southernmost 7 nomes. In the interim, as the exiled leadership adjusted to their reduced domain, much of the central Nile Valley found itself without clear leadership. At Abydos, the sacred city of Osiris, the absence of divine kingship was especially troubling. In response, local elites took the initiative and proclaimed a new ruling line. But lacking experienced craftsmen and trained administrators, these so-called kings of Abydos projected a diminished version of royalty. Their roughly made monuments stood in stark contrast to their lofty ambitions. It was a brave but ultimately unsuccessful effort to maintain Egypt's most sacred institution at one of its most revered religious sites. Within 2 decades, the fledgling dynasty at Abydos had vanished, leaving behind almost no trace. Farther south in Thebes, the refugees from Ijtai found relatively better fortune. To many in Upper Egypt, they remained the rightful rulers of the 2 lands. Loyal families who had once served the old regime continued to support the exiled court. But this impression of continuity was deceptive. The political landscape had shifted dramatically. Once a thriving city, blessed with royal attention and enriched through trade across Egypt and Nubia, Thebes was now cut off. The city was left diminished. Even the gods seemed to have turned away. Natural calamities deepened the nation's suffering. Less than 10 years after the evacuation of Ijtai, a severe flood struck Thebes, inundating the temple of Ammonius at Ipitsut, the spiritual heart of the region. In a gesture of leadership, the king chose to confront the crisis directly, wading into the submerged hall of the sanctuary to assess the damage, while his weary followers trailed behind him in silence. The next Egyptian ruler found himself confronting a devastating trio of crises: famine, flooding, and foreign invasion. Neferhotep III claimed credit for sustaining Thebes through the worst of the food shortages and for defending his city when it was submerged. Yet, when Hyksos' forces pushed southward, all he could do was attempt to bolster public morale, urging the people to face the enemy with courage. Highlighting his role as a military leader was a strategic move to inspire resistance, but titles like Guide of Mighty Thebes seemed more like wishful thinking than a reflection of real power. Across the land, from the throne to the common people, there was a growing dread that Thebes would suffer the same fate as Memphis. The most revealing record from this period is a stela erected at the temple of Ipitsut by King Mentuhotep, a name that evoked traditional Theban authority, though its script betrayed a provincial flair. The inscription follows the customary Egyptian tone of exaggeration, with Mentuhotep likening his troops to crocodiles on the flood. Yet his personal claims to power were telling. Referring to himself as king within Thebes, this my city, he appeared to acknowledge his limited influence. His self-description as one who acts as king was a far cry from the confident declarations of earlier monarchs. Nothing illustrated the collapse of Egyptian authority more clearly than the fate of the southern frontier. As the 13th dynasty declined, the government abandoned the Nubian fortresses, leaving their garrisons behind. In the absence of support, many of these Egyptians sought new livelihoods. The Kingdom of Kush, Egypt's longtime rival and a wealthy trading power in its own right, swiftly moved in. It absorbed the region of Wawat and seized control of the forts with barely any opposition. During the Hyksos occupation of northern Egypt, Egyptians living in Wawat adapted to the new regime, willingly serving their Nubian overlords. At Buhan, a man named Ka proudly declared himself a brave servant of the ruler of Kush. The local commander, Sopter, even took part in restoring the temple of Horus at Buhan, stating it was done to the satisfaction of the ruler of Kush. In dedicating his commemorative inscription, Sopter left no stone unturned. He invoked traditional Egyptian deities like Tasoker Osiris and Horus, the local god of Buhan, as well as the deified Senusret III, yet he also included the unnamed gods that are in Wawat. It was a cautious gesture, clearly meant to please multiple audiences. One can only imagine Senusret III, once the great defender of Egypt's southern border, turning in his grave. Now the roles had reversed. Egyptians, not Nubians, were the ones paying taxes on traded goods. They, not their southern neighbors, were being dictated to. The glorious days of the 12th dynasty must have felt like a distant, fading legend. In stark contrast, the Hyksos kingdom was thriving. As more Asiatic immigrants settled in the eastern delta, existing communities expanded rapidly, giving rise to new settlements and associated cemeteries throughout the region. A significant fortified town was established at Tel El Yahudiyah, complementing the Hyksos' other defensive positions across the frontier zone. Confident in their control of the land, the Hyksos rulers fully embraced and showcased their unique cultural heritage. At Hut-Weret, altars burned continuously with offerings before the principal temple, dedicated to Baal-Zephon, whose cult had quickly merged with that of Seth, the Egyptian storm deity. Young children who passed away were buried according to Asiatic tradition in imported Palestinian amphorae, despite Egyptian versions being sturdier and more protective. In their economic practices, the Hyksos deliberately turned away from Egypt's traditional trade routes. They avoided commercial exchanges with Middle and Upper Egypt, choosing instead to trade extensively with Palestine and Cyprus. Goods like wine, olive oil, timber, and copper poured into the busy harbor at Hut-Weret, enriching the city and transforming it into one of the most prominent royal capitals in the Near East. To demonstrate their power and prosperity, the Hyksos constructed a grand citadel along the Nile. Built on reclaimed land, it spanned over 500,000 square feet and was protected by a massive curtain wall 25 feet thick, reinforced with buttresses. Inside, the royal palace was lavish and luxurious. Gardens and vineyards supplied fresh produce and provided shelter from the intense Egyptian heat, while a specially built, stone-lined channel brought clean water directly from the Nile into the palace grounds. Amid this wealth and security, the character of Hyksos rule began to shift. Earlier rulers had been satisfied with the title rulers of foreign lands, a label previously used during the Middle Kingdom to describe princes from the Near East. But with the rise of King Kian around 1610 BC, a new ambition emerged. At the height of Hyksos dominance, Kian sought recognition as a legitimate Egyptian pharaoh equal to his economic stature. He sent a diplomatic gift to the Minoan king of Knossos on Crete, signaling his entry onto the international stage. At home, Kian adopted a complete pharaonic titulary, beginning with the Horus name "He who embraces the banks of the Nile." This was as much a declaration of his political aims as it was symbolic. His intention was to extend Hyksos' control beyond the delta and bring the whole of Egypt under his rule. A military campaign through Middle Egypt subdued the northern two-thirds of the country. It is even possible that the Hyksos forces captured Thebes briefly before retreating to their northern stronghold, destroying towns and temples along the way. Kian's successor, King Apipi, pushed this ambition further. He took the Horus name pacifier of the two lands, echoing the unifying rhetoric of Amenemhat I at the beginning of the 12th dynasty. On one of his monuments, he referred to himself as beloved of Seth, Lord of Sumenu. By invoking the favor of a local Theban deity, Apipi was symbolically asserting his claim to rule all of Egypt. At that moment, the future of an independent Egyptian state looked more uncertain than ever. Despite numerous setbacks, the desire for Egyptian self-rule never completely faded. When the Hyksos forces withdrew from Upper Egypt and retreated to their stronghold in the delta, it presented the Thebans with a faint but vital opportunity, a chance to rebuild and reorganize. Rahatep, the new ruler of Thebes and the first pharaoh of the 17th dynasty, took immediate steps to revive what had been lost. He initiated restoration efforts at sacred sites damaged by the Hyksos invasions. At Jebtu, he ordered the repair of the Temple of Min, lamenting that its gates and doors had fallen into ruin. Meanwhile, the religious center at Abydos saw the revival of the Osiris-Khenti-Amensu cult. These actions were not just about preserving ancient structures. By restoring temples and re-establishing traditional rites, Rahatep made it clear that he intended to rule as a legitimate Egyptian king, fulfilling the sacred duties expected of pharaohs. Rahatep's successors continued his mission. They repaired and expanded temples at Abydos and Jebtu, both historically significant cities during Egypt's earlier civil conflicts. However, the revival wasn't limited to religion. These locations also served as strategic points in military planning. Garrisons were stationed there, transforming them into advanced positions in preparation for renewed conflict with the Hyksos. Slowly, Thebes was laying the foundations for a political and military comeback. The kings who followed Rahatep also worked to revive another important royal tradition, pyramid construction. The modest rock-cut burial shafts of Neferhotep III and others had fallen far short of former royal standards. But the rulers of the 17th dynasty aspired to restore the grandeur of the Middle Kingdom. On the steep slope of Diare Abu el-Naga, in western Thebes, they established a new royal cemetery. Among the tombs, that of Nubkepra-Intef, the dynasty's fourth king, stands out. His burial chamber was carved directly into the cliff, accessible by a descending shaft. But above ground, there was also a visible symbol of royal power. Though enclosed by a rather poorly built brick retaining wall, the pyramid itself was fashioned from mud bricks. The early Theban rulers lacked the resources to quarry large amounts of stone, so they settled for a more modest solution. The structure was plastered and whitewashed to imitate the appearance of a stone pyramid with smooth casing. At just 43 feet tall, Intef's pyramid could hardly compare to the towering monuments of the 12th dynasty. Nevertheless, the ambition was unmistakable, even if the means were limited. Similarly, Intef used a recycled statue reflecting the dynasty's resourcefulness during this period of revival. Although Nubkepra-Intef may not have possessed the wealth or resources of a great ruler, his determination was unmistakable. At his tomb, he erected obelisks that carried a bold and meaningful message. Through finely carved hieroglyphs, he linked himself with some of Egypt's most revered deities, Osiris Khentiamenchu, the god of Abydos and guardian of resurrection and the afterlife, Anubis, the jackal-headed god who oversaw embalming and burial rites, and somewhat unexpectedly, Sopdu, the lord of foreign lands. Sopdu's presence might seem out of place among these funerary gods, but it was far from accidental. Though a relatively minor deity, Sopdu held important roles. He was considered the protector of foreign regions, particularly the rugged areas of Sinai and southern Palestine. His primary temple stood in Persopdu, right within the heart of the Hyksos-controlled eastern delta. This was a calculated religious maneuver. Just as the Hyksos king Kion had adopted the favor of Theban gods to legitimize his rule, Intef responded in kind by invoking a god rooted in Hyksos territory. By aligning himself with Sopdu, the Theban kings sought divine backing in the political struggle to reclaim territories lost to the foreign rulers. However, divine favor alone would not be enough. For Nubkepra-Intef to rally support against the Hyksos, he first needed to strengthen his dynasty's position in Thebes. Unity was essential. Any internal division could prove disastrous. A vivid example of this internal consolidation survives in a royal decree issued at Jebtu. This document records the kings settling a dispute within the powerful priestly administration of the Temple of Min. Though the specifics of the conflict remain unknown, the king's ruling against an official named Minhotep was harsh and definitive. "Remove him from the temple of my father, Min, expel him from his office, now and for all future generations. Cast him down, and strip him of his provisions, so that his name is no longer remembered in this temple." It's likely that Minhotep's offense wasn't against the temple itself, but against supporters loyal to Intef's regime. This suspicion is reinforced by the identity of the man who benefited from Minhotep's removal, Mimhat, the mayor of Jebtu and a steadfast ally of the 17th dynasty. Through such decisive actions, the Theban rulers gradually tightened their control over Upper Egypt, placing authority in the hands of those they could trust completely. The result was a tightly unified administration, eager to relearn and re-establish traditional systems of governance. Nubkepra-Intef's successor, Sobekmsaf II, around 1560 BC, demonstrated his commitment to this restoration effort by organizing a quarrying expedition to Wadi Hammamat. This marked the first state-backed mission of its kind in over 160 years. While the expedition involved just 130 men and may have been assembled somewhat hastily, it was nonetheless a significant beginning. Further east, in the mineral-rich region of Gebel-Zeit, mining operations resumed with the help of mercenaries recruited from the Medjay, a desert-dwelling people. These efforts not only sourced materials to revive royal workshops but also served as a sign that the Theban regime was expanding its reach, testing its strength, and preparing itself for future conflict. The clearest indication yet of looming military plans came when Sobkamsaf granted a land donation to the temple at Madu, modern Medamud, located just outside Thebes. This choice was deliberate. The deity honored at Madu was Montu, the Theban war god who had once inspired the 11th dynasty in its campaign to reunify Egypt 6 centuries earlier. It was perhaps hoped that Montu's favor would again guide a new generation of Theban warriors in their quest for national redemption. Just as momentum was building, the 17th dynasty was struck by a sudden and devastating setback. From the remote regions of Nubia, a powerful army raised by the king of Kush advanced northward, passing through the Egyptian-built fortresses of Wawat. Their forces swept through Upper Egypt, attacking towns, looting temples, desecrating tombs, and plundering whatever they could seize. What made the invasion especially dangerous was that the Kushite forces had not come alone. The tribes of Wawat had been stirred to action, joined by other groups from Upper Nubia, the distant land of Punt, and the Medjay of the eastern desert, well known for offering their military skills to the highest bidder. This coalition posed a serious threat, uniting former subjugated peoples eager to strike back against Egyptian dominance. The town of Nekheb found itself at the heart of the conflict. Its residents, under the determined leadership of their local governor, mounted a fierce defense. They ultimately drove the attackers back beyond the first cataract. Still, the cost was steep. The governor lost personal property to the invaders, and the Theban forces suffered losses they could scarcely afford. This Kushite incursion came as a harsh surprise to the Theban leadership, but it delivered a critical lesson. Before they could pursue their campaign to reunify Egypt, they would first have to stabilize and defend their vulnerable southern frontier. In the Hyksos capital of Haweret, King Apipi likely sensed that open conflict was on the horizon. Taking no chances, he reinforced the defensive walls surrounding the royal citadel and forged a strategic alliance with the kingdom of Kush. Utilizing desert routes through the oases, he could communicate with the Kushite ruler without needing to pass through Theban-controlled areas. Apipi may have had to offer a share of the spoils to secure Kushite cooperation, but dividing Egypt between their two powers seemed a worthwhile price if it meant permanently ending native Egyptian sovereignty. Ironically, Apipi drew from an old Egyptian tactic to rally his people, a flood of propaganda. He boasted new, increasingly elaborate titles to emphasize his strength and legitimacy, declaring himself resolute in battle, bearing a greater name than any other king, guardian of distant lands unseen by his enemies. His ultimate claim was bold and unequivocal: there is none like him in any land. Unshaken by Apipi's rhetoric, the Theban king Seqenenra Taa responded not with words, but with action. Rather than trading declarations, he laid the groundwork for real battle. His first move was to establish a military headquarters from which to plan the offensive against Memphis and Hutweret. The site he chose was Deir el-Balas, on the Nile's west bank across from Jebtu. There he constructed a fortified palace for the royal household, supported by a large settlement and bakery complex for his entourage. A lookout post atop a nearby hill provided a sweeping view of the Nile Valley. With his command center in place, Seqenenra Taa initiated the first phase of the offensive against Hyksos forces. And he was no passive commander. Tall and powerfully built, with a large head crowned by thick, curly black hair, he cut the image of a warrior king. Inspired by his own sense of destiny, and strengthened by the fierce loyalty of his sister wife, Ahotep, he engaged the enemy directly in battle. Then tragedy struck. During the heat of combat, Taa was fatally wounded. Without protection, he was overwhelmed by attackers wielding axes, spears, and daggers. A blow from an Asiatic axe crushed his skull, killing him instantly. Amid the confusion, there was no time for proper burial preparations. His body was hurriedly embalmed and returned to Thebes. There, in front of a mourning royal family and a stunned citizenry, Taa the Brave, as inscribed on his coffin, was buried. His successor, Kamose, led the funeral procession. Seqenenra Taa had fallen in his prime, after a reign of barely 4 years. Now, the responsibility for Egypt's future rested on Kamose. Young and uncertain of his next steps, the new ruler convened a war council. With emotion and frustration, he voiced the gravity of the nation's plight. Why do I sit idle while one prince rules in Hutweret and another in Kush? I am forced to share Egypt with an Asiatic and a Nubian, each claiming a portion of my land. Never in the 14 centuries since the founding of Egypt's statehood had the country faced such humiliation. While periods of unrest and division had come before, this situation was unparalleled. With foreign rulers occupying both the northern and southern regions, the very survival of Egypt as an independent nation governed by Egyptians hung in the balance. Restoring the two lands would demand continued sacrifice, perseverance, and an unwavering determination to overcome all odds. The liberation of Egypt from Hyksos domination would come to be remembered by future generations as a defining moment of national revival. The monarchs who led the charge for independence would later be honored alongside legendary figures like Menes, the first pharaoh, and Mentuhotep, who reunited Egypt after a long civil war. Egyptologists share this perspective, viewing the removal of the Hyksos as the event that ushered in the New Kingdom, the most illustrious period in Egypt's ancient history. Yet, for those living through it, the experience was far less triumphant. Kamose's lament about the state of his realm was filled with genuine frustration. By 1541 BC, Egypt occupied only a fraction of the territory once ruled by the mighty kings of the 12th dynasty. For many Egyptians, even those in the Theban stronghold, the existing arrangement didn't seem entirely unfavorable. Cooperation with the Hyksos regime at Hutweret brought tangible benefits. The Thebans were allowed to farm and graze animals on land under Hyksos authority, and in return for paying taxes, they even received fodder and other provisions. Kamose's own officials reportedly told him they were content with this arrangement. While this could have been part of a propagandistic narrative crafted to highlight the king's courage in contrast to the supposed timidity of his advisors, there is likely some truth behind it. The Hyksos had introduced new technologies to Egypt, facilitated expansive Mediterranean trade, and managed the country with administrative skill equal to that of native rulers. A strategy of peaceful coexistence might have seemed the easiest path forward. But such a path held no appeal for Kamose or the 17th dynasty, who sought to restore Egypt's former greatness. For a proud Theban, the presence of foreign rulers on Egyptian soil was intolerable. Kamose made his intentions unequivocally clear to his inner circle: "My desire is to reclaim Egypt." Yet before that vision could be realized, Egypt had to contend with two pressing challenges: the lingering Hyksos occupation and the rising threat from Kush. The Kushite ruler had built a powerful army, complete with a strong cavalry, and showed every intent to expand his territory. The earlier raids on Nekheb had taught the Thebans a critical lesson: they needed to secure their southern border before launching any offensive in the north. Facing a numerically superior Hyksos army equipped with better technology, Egypt could not afford to fight on two fronts. The Kushite danger had to be addressed first. Thus, in 1540 BC, in only the second year of his reign and following extensive preparations, Kamose led his troops south. Their mission was clear: retake Wawat and shield it from further incursions, creating a secure buffer zone to the south. As the army advanced through the lightly populated Nile Valley beyond Abu, they met little, if any, resistance. When they reached the base of the Second Cataract, their target came into sight: the fortress of Buhan. Once a vital military hub during the Middle Kingdom, Buhan had easily fallen into Kushite hands in the intervening years. Its Egyptian garrison had quickly adapted, serving their new Nubian rulers as faithfully as they had served previous pharaohs. However, upon seeing Kamose's army approach in force, the occupants of the fort seemed to change allegiance once again without mounting a defense. Greeted as a liberator, Kamose took charge of reinforcing Buhan's defenses and restoring it as a key southern stronghold. As a capable strategist, Kamose's foresight extended beyond the immediate task of defense. With an eye on Egypt's long-term presence in Nubia, he took steps to re-establish centralized control in the region. Relying on the uncertain loyalty of fortress commanders was a risk no wise king would take. Instead, Kamose introduced a new system of governance that would shape Egypt's administration of Nubia for centuries. He appointed a trusted official named Teti as the first king's son of Kush, a viceroy who would represent the pharaoh in all Nubian affairs and report directly to him. With Teti securely positioned at the administrative center in Pharaohs, Kamose returned north to prepare for a much more dangerous confrontation. His approach to the northern front combined psychological warfare with military action. Kamose believed that a campaign of fear and destruction targeting Hyksos-aligned towns in Middle Egypt would shake enemy morale and pave the way for a final offensive. As he declared, "I sailed downstream as a victor to expel the Asiatics, following the will of Ammonius, my courageous army before me, like a storm of fire." His first objective was the town of Nefrusi, situated within Hyksos-controlled territory just north of Kmun, modern El Ashmunian. The town was under the governance of an Egyptian named Teti, son of Pepi. By striking hard and publicly punishing this collaborator, Kamose hoped to send a clear message that would encourage others to defect to the Egyptian side. Under the cover of night, Kamose's forces advanced and launched a dawn assault. I descended upon him like a hawk. My troops were like lions carrying off their prey. The attack was merciless. After plundering the town, Kamose ordered it to be completely destroyed. In the following days, the settlements of Hardai and Prashak met a similar fate. With numerous towns in Middle Egypt reduced to rubble, Hyksos' dominance in the region was shattered. Thebes was advancing, both in territory and momentum. Then, by chance, a valuable opportunity presented itself. Drawing on Thebes' deep familiarity with desert terrain, developed during earlier conflicts, Kamose maintained regular patrols along the desert routes. These surveillance units monitored activity, watching for suspicious movements and gathering intelligence. The Hyksos, too, depended on these routes for trade with Kush. Though Thebes was officially under Hyksos control, sending goods through rebel territory along the Nile was too great a risk. Instead, the route between Seko, modern Elkes, and Kerma, the Kushite capital, ran through the western desert oases and was heavily traveled by caravans and diplomatic envoys. One such envoy was intercepted by Kamose scouts near the oasis of Jesjes, modern Bahariya. To their astonishment, the messenger was found carrying a letter from the Hyksos ruler to the new king of Kush. Its contents were staggering. From the ruler of Hutweret, Usera Apipi, greetings to the son of the king of Kush. Why have you taken the throne without notifying me? Have you seen what Egypt has done to me? The king there, Kamose, has invaded my territory without provocation, attacking both my lands and yours. He has ravaged them both. Come north, do not hesitate. He is within my reach. No one in Egypt will resist you. I will not allow him to pass until you arrive. Then, we shall divide the cities of Egypt between us. Despite expressing frustration over not being informed of the Kushite succession, Apipi extended a bold proposal to his southern ally. If the Kushites joined him in a military campaign, he would share control of Egypt. It was a textbook case of divide and conquer. For the Thebans, the intercepted letter confirmed their greatest fear. Kamose reacted swiftly and instinctively. Rather than executing the unlucky messenger, he chose to send him back to Hutweret with a message of his own directed at Apipi. I will not leave you in peace. I will not allow you to walk the earth without my pursuit. To reinforce this threat, Kamose ordered the messenger to report the recent Theban victories in Middle Egypt, highlighting not only the bravery and resolve of his army but their ability to strike deep into Hyksos-controlled territory. Apipi's appeal for Kushite assistance had exposed a critical vulnerability. Suddenly, the idea of a Theban offensive against Hutweret itself no longer seemed far-fetched. If Kamose's first-hand account of the campaign is to be trusted, he did in fact press his attack all the way to the Hyksos capital. He boasted of reaching the outskirts of Hutweret, indulging in wine from Apipi's vineyards, felling his trees, violating his women, and seizing cargo ships filled with luxury goods imported from the Near East: gold, lapis lazuli, silver, turquoise, countless bronze axes, morina oil, incense, fat, honey, willow, and boxwood. He claimed he had approached close enough to see the royal fortress where Hyksos women, terrified, peered over the walls like baby mice hiding in their holes. Kamose organized his navy into formation and launched a bold assault on the Hyksos stronghold. However, the attack did not succeed. Despite the setback, Kamose returned to Thebes presenting himself as a triumphant warrior, leading his army home in victory. True to pharaonic tradition, he commissioned a series of monumental stelae to be erected in the temple of Ammonius at Ipitsut, proclaiming his military feats to future generations. But the celebrations were cut short by his sudden death just a few months later, in 1539. The exact cause remains unknown. Despite his courage and determination, Kamose did not receive the burial of a triumphant hero. He was laid to rest in a simple, unadorned coffin, accompanied only by 2 daggers. Kamose's passing was a heavy blow to Egypt. The sense of grief was likely compounded by uncertainty surrounding the royal succession. Only 3 years earlier, Kamose had probably been chosen over the rightful heir because he was old enough to continue the fight that had taken the life of Seqenenra. With Kamose now gone, the throne could no longer bypass the designated successor. Egypt entered a period of uneasy waiting. 10 long years passed as Thebes prepared for the young Prince Ahmose to reach maturity. During this time, Egypt maintained control over Buhan, keeping the Kushite threat in check. Meanwhile, Apipi's weakened forces were in no condition to strike. But without a leader of their own, the Thebans could not take the initiative either. All they could do was hold their position and prepare for the battles yet to come.